thought we might start today with a little trivia. So, see if this sounds familiar. Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. All we ask is that you let us serve it your way. Does that sound familiar to anybody? In the 1970s, this was a jingle that you could pretty much hear on any television station. So the question is, does anybody remember the fast food restaurant that got the nation singing this number? Yeah, Burger King, that's right. It was and it still is Burger King's desire that they might serve us in any way that we ask. And I kind of wonder if James and John were alive today, if Burger King might be their favorite place to eat. Serve us in any way we ask. Because that's essentially what these two brothers are asking Jesus in our text for today. Jesus, we want you to serve us in any way that we ask. And Jesus says to them, how might that be? Serve us, Jesus, by letting us bask in your glory, one at your right and one at your left. Of course, as has been the case throughout the Gospel of Mark, James and John just don't seem to get it. But they aren't alone. None of the disciples truly understand what Jesus means when he speaks of coming into his glory in the kingdom of heaven. James and John and the others have their minds set on things of this earth and not on things that are above. In the early years in the earthly kingdoms, the most powerful people sat next to their kings, one at the right and one at the left. And James and John just can't get their heads around any other kind of kingdom besides the one that which they've known on earth. And I sometimes wonder if I had been alive at the time, if I could have imagined anything different either. Jesus tells these men that he will not serve them in any way that they ask. Because you see, while James and John don't fully understand Jesus' purpose, Jesus does. Jesus is certain about the mission that God has called him to do, that God has sent him to do, the purpose of his life and of his death. Jesus explains to his disciples, even the Son of Man did not come for people to serve him. He came to serve others and to give his life to save many. And so we hear the good news today. God's mission fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus came to serve God and to serve all people throughout time and to give his life to save us, to give us a new life. God's work, Jesus' hands, changed lives. Jesus understood his purpose, a purpose that changed and is continuing to change the lives of people. And Jesus understands our purpose as well. He tells us, come, follow my example. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must serve the rest of you as if a slave. Now, we cannot redeem people as Jesus did, of course, but those who do follow Jesus are called to pour out their lives for one another. I want to share a story with you this morning that I got permission to tell because it's about my husband. About 4 years ago, my husband Paul and I decided we needed to make some healthy changes in our lives, so we decided to start walking to work. So every day, I would trek up to the junior high, and he would head out to Federated Insurance. We live on Redwood Place, which is by the old clinic building. On this one particular day, Paul started his usual path heading north on Cedar Avenue. It was during the summer months, so it was a bit humid and the temperatures were beginning to climb, and it felt like by the minute. As he got about halfway to work, he came upon two people, a woman and a man who was a little bit older than she, but was relying on a cane. And the two were struggling to change a very flat tire on a car parked next to the curb. As Paul came upon them, the man asked him if he might help. Paul assessed the situation and soon realized that the car was parked so close to the curb that there was no way they were going to be able to get the tire off, let alone put a new one on. Paul figured the only way he would be of help was to run back home and grab a floor jack and bring it back to jack the car up. So he jogged back home, threw our floor jack in our car, and headed back to the woman and the man and the crippled car. Once Paul got the car jacked up, he was able, of course, to take the flat tire off and put the spare one right back on. And by the time all was said and done, Paul was dripping with sweat and looked fairly unpresentable to walk into work. So he decided he should probably go home and shower again and start all over. As he was about to say goodbye to the woman and the man turned to Paul and asked him a question. And he said to him, "Are you a man of God?" Of course, you can imagine Paul was kind of taken aback. And he answered the man and looked in his face and he said, "I am." Then the man wrapped his arms around Paul, and as he did, he said to him, "I could tell." Paul was speechless. He was humbled. And he was thankful that God had chosen him to do God's work on that very day. Because in all honesty, Paul tells me he actually was going to walk by those people that day. He was going to miss the opportunity that God had presented to him until the voice of God was heard from that man with the cane when he said, "Will you help me?" After that, Paul went home and he did shower and change and get ready for work and start on his way just like he had an hour previously, except within that one single hour, lives had been changed. God sees greatness in us, his children, when we are serving one another in love. The writer of our 1 John text understood that very well, and we heard today, we know love by this, that he laid down our life, his life for us, and that we ought to lay down our lives for others. You know, I think back to last week when we had 5 young members of our congregation standing in front of us, and as Pastor Dean says, one not so young member, sharing their messages of how God had called them into his mission, how they had gone throughout the United States and lives were changed. God's work, our hands changing lives. I have had the great joy of watching our stewardship video several times this week. And each and every time that I watch it, I marvel at the looks on the faces of those people who are being served, but also of those who are serving. People from this congregation who have answered the call that Jesus has on their life. God's work, our hands, changing lives. And in these past 6 weeks that I have had the privilege of serving as your intern pastor, I have witnessed God's mission, God's work lived out in the hands of this congregation, and lives are being changed. I have listened to stories of this congregation's befrienders who sit at the feet of those that they serve, just listening to them with care and compassion, just loving those they serve. God's work, our hands, changing lives. I have watched people from this congregation with a passion for youth education sit around a table and commit themselves to the education of not only their own children, but of children they don't even know, children on the Pine Ridge Reservation, loving those they serve without even knowing who they are. That's God's work, our hands, and it's changing lives. I sat at a council meeting not too long ago, where at the end of the meeting, hands were joined and prayers were lifted up, not only for this congregation and its needs, but for the entire church around the world and its needs. That council was loving others outside of themselves. That is God's work, our hands changing lives. And finally, I have seen the trembling hands of the sick grasp a small wooden cross as it's offered to them at their hospital bed. a cross that was carved by the hands of this congregation. I've seen this cross sitting at other bedsides of people that I visit that have received them long ago, but they keep them very close at hand. I have seen this cross in the hands of a beloved sister of this congregation as Jesus called her home to God's arms in heaven. This cross is God's mission, God's work, and it's your hands, and it's changing lives. As Jesus said, if you want to be great, you must become a servant of all. If you want to be first, you must serve others as a slave. He said, I didn't come here to be served. I came to serve. And you can be a part of that too. Amen.